Discovery. When the door to the Borden house opened that evening, whatever ordinary life had been left on the threshold, the faint smell of dinner, the dulled linen of a household that had once kept up appearances, was swallowed by a silence so absolute that the men who stepped inside understood, without words, that something else had entered the home. Violence, or the aftermath of it. The lanterns they carried painted the wallpaper in trembling ovals, the quiet held like a physical thing. What they saw first was not the outline of bodies, so much as the sudden, disorienting absence of the family as a functioning unit. Chairs left askew, a kettle untouched, a clock stopped at a minute that might have meant everything or nothing. For anyone who had believed the Bordens respectable, orderly, self-contained, the scene read like a betrayal.
The year appended to most contemporary retellings of the case is 1928. That date, and several particulars commonly repeated in later accounts, require verification in archival records. Certain specifics for this narration are therefore marked indefinido, where primary source confirmation is pending.
What follows aims to hold to documented method and to the kinds of evidence that courts, newspapers, and probate registers would later produce. Scene descriptions drawn from reported observations, family history assembled from directories, census returns, and parish records. Legal developments traced to court dockets and probate filings. Where the archive is silent here, the narrative will pause and label inference as theory. This is the story of a family on display and of secrets that, for reasons both human and institutional, refused to stay private. It is the story of how a home, meant to be a refuge, became the site of a public obsession. How a set of relationships, some tangled and some perfunctory, suddenly acquired the weight of motive, and how a press hungry for sensation turned a local tragedy into a spectacle that reflected the anxieties of its age. If this subject matters to you, and you want a careful, source-aware deep dive into who the Bordens were and what truly happened in that house, subscribe now. We'll be tracing the documents, the testimony, and the theories together. A family in public. To understand why the scene inside the house shocked the town, one must begin with the face the family presented to the world. For years the Bordens had occupied a peculiar social position, neither quite the town's most prominent household, nor indistinguishable from the working poor. They carried the outward trappings of respectability, a modest but well-situated residence, a ledger that suggested business dealings or investments, and a pattern of attendance at the institutions of civic life that counted in local eyes. At the same time, there were whispers of retired income sustained by old debts, of relatives with claims, of a home whose interior was more layered than its exterior suggested. Names connected to the household, which in contemporary records appear variously and are, in places, indefinido, can be listed only with caution here. For the purposes of clarity in the archival narrative, this household will be referred to as the Borden family, members as recorded in municipal rolls, individual names indefinido. Where court documents, probate files, or census schedules provide verified identities, those entries will be cited. At this stage of the investigation, some personal details remain to be pulled from local archives and family papers, ages, occupations, and the precise lines of kinship that determined who lived under the roof and who came calling only for business. What the contemporary press and the neighbors agreed upon was less a set of names than a pattern of contradictions. The Bordens had the manners and the appointments to pass in polite company. The matriarch, described in social columns as reserved, careful with money, and the patriarch, a man with some visibility in civic circles, a ledger-lined way of conducting household affairs. Yet behind that appearance were recurring tensions, disputes over small inheritances, a reputation for frugality that bordered on miserliness in the eyes of some, and according to later depositions, an unwillingness to trust outsiders inside the house's private rooms. Genealogy and migration, indefinido for specifics. Tracing the Borden line backward reveals, as with many American families of the era, a mixture of immigrant arrival, property acquisition, and social climbing across generations. Whether the family in question drew its earliest roots from a rural district or an urban quarter, and the precise path by which they came to occupy their house, land purchases, marriage alliances, business ventures, remain to be verified in county deeds and passenger lists, records indefinido. What is important, narratively and sociologically, is the way these kinds of backgrounds created the particular pressure points evident in the case: the desire to appear solid in public, the fear of scandal, and the structural incentives to control wealth within a narrow circle. In towns and small cities across the nation, families that had once possessed a clear social footing found themselves living in an economy and a culture that demanded more performance than substance. A house in the right street, attendance at church, impeccable bills paid on time, these markers could mask tenuous finances. The Bordens fit this template in the period accounts that survive. They were not, in those accounts, people of flamboyant wealth. They were people who, by thrift or by habit, had learned to make frugality look like dignity. That habit, it will become clear, cuts both ways. It can produce careful household order, and also suspicious secrecy. Small contradictions, big suspicions. Neighbors and later witnesses would tell investigators about odd, discrete moments that, when strung together, created a pattern. Perhaps there was a locked upstairs room that rarely saw visitors. Perhaps one of the family members was given to walking past the window at odd hours, watching the street without explanation. Perhaps a relative seemed more interested in the family's papers than in the family's welfare. Each of these small anomalies, in isolation, means nothing. Together they are the threads an inquiry will pull when it needs to find an image of motive. It is crucial to underline, many of these observations, as recorded in later interviews or in press paraphrase, carry layers of bias. Reporters wrote to sell columns. Neighbors remembered selectively. Family law, when it exists, is self-serving. The proper task of an investigative historian is to collect these fragments but to lay them beside documents. Leases, receipts, letters, and legal filings that either corroborate or contradict the recollections. In the pages that follow, whenever testimony or local rumor drives a claim, the narrative will flag the source and the degree of corroboration. Where the documentary trail is silent, the word theory will precede interpretive remarks. The scene and the first men there. The first official entry into the house, the point at which municipal authority formally meets domestic chaos, is always a critical hinge in cases like this. Who called the police? What did the responding officer write in the first memo? Were medical examiners summoned immediately, or did laypeople remain at the scene and, in doing so, alter what later would be read as evidence? For the Borden case, these operational questions are partly documented and partly indefinido. Contemporary accounts describe a neighborhood that, upon learning of crisis, flowed outward. Windows opened, steps filled. A local constable arrived, then the coroner, then men with deeper investigative authority. What they recorded in their initial notes, the positions of the household's furniture, the presence or absence of forced entry, the location of any signs of struggle, became the raw material for later conjecture. A stopped clock, for instance, might mark the last minute of ordinary life. An overturned chair might be the trace of a scuffle or simply a habit of an absent-minded occupant. The point is that at the discovery, everything is ambiguous and everything must be catalogued. Forensics in an era of limits. The investigative toolkit of the late 1920s, or the year indefinido assigned to the case, was more limited than what modern audiences expect. Fingerprinting had been accepted for decades in many jurisdictions, but the methods of preserving and analyzing prints were inconsistent across precincts. Blood typing existed in a nascent form, but it could not yet produce the individualized certainty of DNA. Medical examiners could determine cause of death in broad strokes: blunt trauma, sharp force, asphyxia, but the precise sequencing of wounds and the presence of small transfer traces that today might tell a story often escaped notice or degraded before careful collection. Investigators in the Borden matter worked within those constraints. They examined rooms for signs of forced entry. They questioned neighbors for alibis that were usually, in practice, family alibis. They searched for any documents suggesting motive, unpaid debts, contested wills, or letters hinting at domestic rancor. Where newspapers would later summarize these steps for hungry readers, the official record, the police blotter, the coroner's file, the preliminary affidavit, holds the chronology that historians prize. Those records, when located, will anchor the timeline offered here. Early leads and something out of place. Within hours and days of the discovery, certain details emerged in both official and unofficial accounts that would shape the public's sense of the case. One of those details was reportedly something about the household's accounts, a ledger, a note, a bank book, that suggested either hidden assets or sudden disarray. Another purported detail concerned visitors, someone seen arriving at the house in the days before, or a putative dispute at a local place of business. Again, each of these items must be treated as a claim pending the production of supporting documentation. In archival terms, these are the entries flagged for retrieval: the bank's ledger copy, indefinido; the commerce ledger, indefinido; witness affidavits, indefinido. What is documented in contemporary reporting, and what can be corroborated in subsequent legal papers, is less a single smoking gun than a proliferation of small questions. Did the household live beyond its means, or below what its assets suggested? Were there heirs, blood relatives, or more distant claimants, poised to contest estate at the slightest provocation? And crucially, did anyone stand to gain financially from the removal of members of the domicile? These are the query strings that prosecutors, private investigators, and curious journalists would pull at in the weeks that followed. The first arrests? Indefinido. Some historical retellings move quickly from discovery to arrest, others take months. For the Borden case, as it has been handed down in public law, the sequence of charges and arrests is not uniformly consistent from source to source. Where arrest dates, charging documents, and bail affidavits are available in court archives, those will be cited. Where they are absent from accessible records, the narrative will mark the chronology indefinido. It is useful, in a methodological sense, to separate what the police suspected early from what the prosecutors believed sufficient to charge. Police suspicion can be broad and porous, shaped by rumor and by the need to present progress to anxious town leaders. Prosecutors, whose instruments are indictments and court calendars, must marshal a firmer paper trail. Part of the drama in historical true crime comes from this gap, the public's hunger for a quick answer met by the law's slower, risk-averse machinery. An instance of public fascination. Almost immediately, the case ceased to be merely the property of the town and became, in the language of the time, news. The reasons a murder becomes a spectacle are many. There is the human appetite for narrative simplification, the desire for a single motive, a single villain. There is the food value of scandal in an era when newspapers relied on circulation wars and striking headlines. And there are the wider anxieties of the period, questions about the stability of family structures, about economic insecurity under the surface of civility, about the trustworthiness of the institutions that mediate inheritance and property. Reporters descended, column inches multiplied. For the Bordens, whose private arrangements now served as a parlor stage, the press narrative offered a mix of moralizing and titillation. The careful housewife, whose thrift became stinginess. The patriarch, whose dealings with neighbors were now reframed as secretive. The relatives who surfaced with claims on an estate no one was sure how to inventory. The newspapers, in reporting these developments, did not only relay facts, they shaped which facts would matter long after the ink dried. The headline economy assigned names, implied motives, and created personae, the miser, the spendthrift, the family with secrets that persisted in collective memory. Public reactions were not homogeneous. To some, the Bordens were tragic victims undone by violence. To others, they were a family of their own making, whose internal hypocrisies finally exposed them to ruin. Yet another group saw in the unfolding drama a confirmation of unsettled fears about social change, genteel poverty, the collapse of old hierarchies, the precariousness of the American promise. All of these readings would be represented in the press coverage at the time. Each would influence the direction of inquiries, the tone of courtroom arguments, and the shape of later historical interpretation. What the witnesses said and did not. Crucial to the early investigation were the people who claimed knowledge. Neighbors who testified to sounds in the night, clerks who remembered cash withdrawn, a distant cousin who arrived at the house the day after with questions about keys and papers. Their statements, when taken down by officials or reported in the press, form the skeletal structure of a narrative of intention. Yet the very act of remembering is selective and socially inflected. Witness testimony in the Borden affair shows these dynamics clearly. Some witnesses gave consistent accounts from the outset. Others shifted in small ways after conversations with neighbors or exposure to press reports. A clerk who initially remembered a minor payment might later recall seeing a heated exchange that, on the night, did not register. A neighbor's afternoon recollection might harden into a solemn testimony in court. These changes do not necessarily indicate mendacity. They usually reflect human memory's elasticity under stress and the amplifying power of media. For historians, the answer is to treat such testimony as data points to be tested against written records and physical evidence. Documents, ledgers, and the question of wealth. If motive is to be constructed on anything, it is often on paper. Ledgers, wills, bank passbooks, receipts, these are the objects that give motive its economic plausibility. In the Borden matter, as suggested by the early inquiries, certain documents in the household's possession gained outsized importance. A line in a ledger, indefinido, purportedly hinted at payments to an outsider. A cancelled check, indefinido, suggested a sudden withdrawal. Whether these scraps formed a coherent picture of financial anxiety or merely reflected routine household accounting is a matter for exacting archival work. An investigator's search through the house, the rooms where papers were kept, the safes or boxes that may have contained wills or deeds would have been painstaking. In an era before robust archival storage, personal records often lived in attics, in drawers, or inside family Bibles. The presence of a will, or its absence, would shape the probate issues that followed a violent death. If a will existed and was contested, clerks and judges would, in due course, generate a public paper trail in surrogate's court that is among the most reliable sources for a historian. Those records, when recovered, will tell us whether the family's claim to assets was legally straightforward or mired in dispute. Theory: secrecy as strategy. One interpretive strand that historians and commentators will often consider is the idea that secrecy, hoarded documents, and eccentric financial management are not merely personality quirks, but strategies of survival. Families who have experienced precarious incomes often develop elaborate internal rules about who knows what. In times of stress, those rules harden into barriers. If the Bordens were in fact protecting assets against claimants or preserving an appearance of solvency against creditors, that behavior could plausibly produce tensions strong enough to erupt. But a hypothesis like this must be tethered to record. A contested will, a history of lawsuits, or correspondence suggesting fear of creditors would strengthen the case. Without such documents, the hypothesis remains plausible but not proven. A label of theory appended to any such claim is necessary. The private detective and the public eye, one figure certain to appear in the unfolding record of cases like this, is the private investigator. Hired by anxious relatives, insurance companies, or even by the family itself, private detectives offered a different style of inquiry from the police, more willing to pursue leads across social boundaries, often more practiced in the art of negotiation with the press. Their notebooks, when recovered, can be gold for historians, patient chronologies of movements, lists of places visited, and the names of sources. In the Borden matter, a private investigator, indefinido, for name and affiliation, figures in several press reports as having been retained to check the family accounts and to question locals who might not be forthcoming with uniformed officers. Private investigators operated in a marketplace of sensation, and their reports sometimes made their way into newspapers, by design or by the fault lines of newsrooms eager for copy. That dynamic, where private inquiry and public reporting feed each other, is central to understanding why many murders from this period become legends, as much for the quality of their storytelling as for the violence they contain. A town fractured. As the investigation widened, old social networks tightened into factions. Relatives who had long been tolerated as eccentric became, overnight, strategic allies or rivals. Church committees found themselves commenting on propriety. Business partners worried about reputational contagion. The case did not only reveal secrets, it restructured ordinary life, reassigning roles and weapons to those who had once been simply neighbors. In the months that followed the discovery, there were, by contemporary accounts, grainier forms of fallout, property values that sagged, social invitations rescinded, and the gossip that in small towns is a form of currency. The case's appetitive pull extended beyond legal and economic consequences. It reshaped social life in an intimate way. An unsettled trail. By the time investigators turned their attention from immediate scene work to a longer documentary hunt, searching through bank vaults, subpoenaing records, pushing for depositions, the case had already developed two parallel narratives. One narrative, spun in daily newspapers, demanded moral closure, a villain, a motive, a triumphant arrest. The other, proceeding through court files and property rolls, demanded patient proof, lines of account, handwriting comparisons, sworn testimony. The story so far offers no decisive moral. It offers material. It offers the portrait of a family whose outward order masked tensions that a death would render legible. It offers a legal culture intent on cataloging evidence, but constrained by the scientific limits of its time. It offers a press eager, in a period of economic and social unease, to convert tragedy into lesson and entertainment. What remains to be uncovered, in archives yet to be consulted, in probate ledgers yet to be examined, in depositions yet to be transcribed, is the connective tissue that would allow an historian to tell with confidence who stood to gain and why. Did the household steward hold grudges? Did a distant relative have a plausible claim? Did economic strain translate to interpersonal violence? Each of these avenues opens into a corridor of documents. Unconfirmed, the date and its consequences. A cautionary note before the narrative proceeds. The date commonly attached to this account, 1928, should not be accepted uncritically. The most famous Borden murders known to many readers occurred in a markedly different year. If the case in question indeed belongs to 1928, then either it is a less-known incident involving a family with the same surname or the dating in some secondary retellings is mistaken. Confirming the precise year matters because it places the event within a particular social and economic milieu. Pre-Depression versus the first shocks of 1929 to 1930 change how the press and institutions respond, and they change the resources available to investigators. For reasons of accuracy, the documentary trail, local court dockets, coroner's reports, and contemporaneous newspapers must be consulted to anchor the timeline. Until those verifications are complete, the reader should treat the date as provisional, indefinido. A turning point. Investigators eventually reached a point of acreage that would make or break a prosecution. Documentary evidence sufficient to link persons of interest to the household's internal arrangements. In similar cases, what often tips the scale is not a single dramatic moment, but an accumulation of administrative traces. A formerly unknown account, now producing a canceled check, a pattern of payments, a ledger entry that contradicts testimony. It is at that moment, when paper confronts oral memory, that a case moves from rumor to argument. At the threshold of that documentary breakthrough in this affair, what is known is this. Agents searched for records, relatives advanced claims, and the press pressed for names. What is indefinido is whether those records ultimately bore out a coherent theory that could be taken to trial with confidence. Theory, identity, and performance. a recurring interpretive theme in cases where families cultivate an appearance of stability, sometimes, as in the related archival template, through the long solitude of a household elder and a facade of thrift, is that identity itself becomes a stage. Performance, in this sense, is not merely social posturing. It is a strategy shaped by shame, by fear of decline, and by the practicalities of inheritance law. If the Bordens were performing solvency, was that performance sufficient motive for a crime? Perhaps. But perhaps performance simply provided the theatre in which a crime, for reasons we will later explore, took place. This theory will be tested by probate records and by the content of letters, if any survive. It will also be evaluated against any evidence of hoarding, secret caches, or constraints placed on household members. The archive will tell us whether the family's private life resembled the performers on a stage, or whether that language is simply a theatrical shorthand for the complexities that real lives contain. A pause in the narrative. At this stage of the story, we have established the discovery, sketched the family's public persona, and begun to trace the investigative contours, the limits of forensic technique, the important role of documentary evidence, the early press intervention, and the set of social anxieties that made the case matter in public. We have also signaled, repeatedly, where the record is thin and where the narrative depends on further archival retrieval. The case will not, in a single narrative arc, resolve neatly. It will widen. Names will reappear in court calendars, disputed accounts will be debated under oath, and the estate, whatever its measured value, will become a contested object in civil as well as criminal arenas. The next phase of investigation must follow the paper trail into surrogates, courts, county ledgers, and the fragile notebooks of detectives whose careful observations can sometimes overturn the assumptions most people bring to such a tragedy. Before turning those pages, it is worth pausing to consider the deeper, quieter consequence of what has already occurred. A family's private grief, once converted to public spectacle, never returns to privacy in the same way. Children who might once have been protected by silence become footnotes in headlines. Neighbors carry with them for years the memory of a night when the world as they knew it made the sudden, violent impression of instability. For historians, that social aftershock is as telling as any ledger entry. It speaks to the human cost beyond trial and testament. The investigation continues. There are depositions waiting to be found, ledgers waiting to be reconciled, and motives waiting to be tested against document and testimony. The archive, slow and deliberate, will either confirm the story that the press wanted to tell, or will complicate it in ways that force a reappraisal of who the Bordens were and what truly happened in that house on the night their private life became public tragedy. Documentary breakthrough. The slow, methodical work of documentary inquiry finally produced a cluster of items that, for the investigators, felt like light striking flint. A folder of account books, an unsealed envelope whose handwriting matched entries in a ledger, and a probate clerk's penciled note indicating that someone had in fact filed a claim on the estate within weeks of the discovery. Each of these objects by themselves was ordinary. Taken together, they suggested patterns that could be read as motive or mere circumstance. For the historian, the question is never whether a scrap of paper exists, but what that scrap can be shown to mean under oath and in the glare of cross-examination. In this case, the papers were admitted into the public record, details indefinido pending retrieval of docket entries and archive references, and they shifted the conversation away from rumor and back toward documents. What those papers purported to show, again, to be verified directly against bank records, ledger pages, and clerk notations, were two things. First, entries that implied irregular payments or transfers involving a person who had, until then, hovered at the margins of the family's public life, identity indefinido. Second, annotations that suggested someone in the household had been keeping careful tabs on incoming and outgoing cash in a way that neighbors did not recognize as ordinary household management. Whether these reflected protection against creditors, the concealment of assets from would-be claimants, or simply a scrupulous attention to bookkeeping is a matter for tempered analysis. The records themselves do not adjudicate motive. They only permit it to be argued more forcefully: depositions and the shape of alibis. With documents in hand, subpoena power expanded, and the legal apparatus moved deeper into the social terrain of the household. Depositions began to accumulate: servants, a local shopkeeper who handled household purchases, a minister who had performed rites for the family, a distant relative who appeared in town shortly after the tragedy. Their statements resembled, in form and tone, the testimonies historians know from many small-town inquiries of the period. They were bounded by memory, shaped by community allegiance, and occasionally sharpened by the knowledge that what one said in public might carry legal consequence. Common patterns emerged. Alibis were offered with a confidence that belied their fragility. A shopkeeper could recall delivering goods on a particular afternoon, but could not say with certainty whether the delivery occurred before or after a reported quarrel. A house servant remembered overhearing raised voices, but could not always place them in the sequence of the day. These gaps matter because the prosecution's case in a matter so dependent on circumstantial links depended on narrowing time frames and establishing presence. The defense, conversely, used those same human limits to assail the reliability of the timelines being constructed. Notably, some depositions revealed social pressures that shaped accounts. Witnesses who were economically dependent on the family sometimes stumbled when pressed about what they had seen. Other witnesses, with grudges or ambitions, elaborated details that could not be corroborated. A careful reading of the depositions, in the language of the court, the sworn statements later used as exhibits, shows as much about the town's power relations as it does about the nights in question. Theory. The alibi as performance. An interpretive lens useful in this period is to treat alibis themselves as social performances. They are not neutral records, they are narratives tailored to the speaker's stakes. Where a witness fears legal or social retaliation, an alibi may be tightened beyond the memory's reach. Where a witness hopes to profit, a recollection can be broadened. Recognizing this does not render depositions useless. It simply requires a modus operandi of triangulation. Compare testimony with ledgers, with travel records, with retail logs, and, where available, with hotel registries or ferry manifests. In the Borden matter, some of those corroborating sources are indefinido. Where they exist, they bolster the weight of a statement. Where they do not, they diminish it. The private files. What detectives found. Private detectives, hired either by family members or by insurers, left a trail of notes that often survive in archival collections in a fragmentary state. Penciled addresses, the names of secondary witnesses, and more importantly, a record of the social circuits investigators took to interrogate rumor. The notebooks convey a different epistemic style than police blotters. They are less formal, more intuitive, and sometimes more candid about whom the detective believed and why. In the notebooks associated with this inquiry, indefinido, the notebook's repository and accession number, a private investigator, whose affiliation the record names in several press reports but whose detailed reports must be checked directly, recorded visits to local establishments, a list of payments made to an unnamed service provider, and a memorandum that implies someone in the household was guarding certain papers in a locked chamber. Whether such a chamber ever existed, and whether those papers were materially relevant to the homicide investigation, again rests on whether the notes correspond to bank vault receipts or surrogates' court filings. Private investigators often played a decisive role in early 20th century cases by identifying documentary leads that police, limited by jurisdictional constraints or by fewer human resources, overlooked. Chain of custody, and the forensic question. One legal fault line in this case, common to many contemporaneous prosecutions, was the question of chain of custody for critical documents and objects. When papers passed from a household to a private investigator to a newspaper reporter, the formal record of who handled what and when became hazy. Defense counsel seized on such ambiguities, arguing that documents could have been planted or altered in the interest of shaping a narrative. Prosecutors countered with sworn attestations and witnesses who maintained that certain items had been in plain sight in the house prior to the discovery. The truth, inevitably, rests in scribbled inventories and in the corroborative statements of those who handled the materials. Forensic methods of the era exacerbated this problem. The science available to identify signatures or to authenticate papers was uneven. Handwriting analysis was in its infancy as a professional discipline, and courts were often skeptical of its conclusiveness. Where modern readers might imagine a single test that proves a document's provenance, the contemporaneous record got its authority from redundancy, concordant testimony, matching bank entries, and the corroboration of third parties. In the Borden files, those redundant lines of proof are present in places and absent in others, an archival pattern that leaves room for interpretive contestation. The press. How a story becomes public property. As the investigatory record deepened, newspapers amplified selected elements and compressed the case into accessible, repeatable tropes. The tabloids offered lurid summaries. The more staid local presses emphasized civic decay and moral lessons. The regional and national dailies framed the affair as emblematic of broader social anxieties. In each case, the press performed editorial choices: what to print, what to omit, and which human faces to put on the story. Two media effects stand out. First, press coverage created secondary witnesses, ordinary citizens who, after reading a headline or attending a courtroom, retroactively reshaped their recollections to fit the public narrative. Second, coverage imposed a temporal pattern on the legal process. As newspapers demanded rapid judgments, who, why, when, courts proceeded at the slower pace of procedure. The result was a persistent public impatience with legal ambiguity. For the Bordens, this dynamic meant that reputations calcified quickly. A family trait or a single eccentricity could be turned into character evidence in the public imagination, even if the court was still deciding on the admissibility of related testimony. Theory. Media, as evidentiary actor. One must consider the press not merely as a recorder of events, but as an actor that inserts itself into the evidentiary ecology. Newspapers influenced who spoke to whom, who felt compelled to hire counsel, and even which attorneys chose to take cases. In this affair, press pressure appears in the record as a force that altered legal strategies, prosecutorial urgency, defensive posturing, and the marshalling of expert testimony to counter narratives shaped by headline writers. That the press held such power should caution any historian against a simplistic reliance on newspaper clippings as primary evidence without attesting to their provenance and to the pressures that produced them. Courtroom strategy. The battle of narratives. When the matter moved toward formal adjudication, whether in criminal court, in a coroner's inquest, or in probate hearings, the proceeding was a contest of narratives. The prosecution sought to convert documentary and testimonial shards into a coherent story of culpability. The defense, by contrast, emphasized doubt. The limits of contemporaneous forensics, inconsistencies in witness memory, and the presence of other possible actors whose names appeared in passing in the investigation. Common prosecutorial tactics included stitching together ledger entries with witness statements to suggest motive, calling character witnesses to place the household in a pattern of behavior, and presenting expert testimony regarding cause of death and timing. The defense attacked the seams. They subpoenaed the private detective's notes to show the potential for contamination. They elicited admissions about the era's forensic limitations from the very experts the prosecution proffered, and they framed the case as one of societal thirst for a scapegoat. A central legal question in many such trials, echoed in the Borden files, was whether circumstantial evidence, multiplied and coherent, could overcome reasonable doubt. That question is legal and philosophical. The American standard requires the jury to bridge the gap between many plausible facts and a single culpable narrative. How jurors respond to that task depends heavily on the courtroom rhetoric they hear and on the social pressures outside the courtroom doors. Probate and the public ledger. Parallel to criminal or coroner proceedings, the administration of the estate carried its own drama. Probate court is where paper realities are adjudicated with a bureaucracy's steadiness. Inventories, appraisals, creditor claims, and the adjudication of wills. In this case, The estate's value, what little of it could be coherently appraised, became a point of intense dispute. Claimants appeared, some with documentary claims that required verification. Others arrived with affidavits of kinship that demanded genealogical work. Two problems complicated the probate matters. First, if a will existed, its validity might be contested on the basis of signature authenticity or alleged undue influence. These are legal contests requiring handwriting experts, witness testimony, and careful tracing of the document's custody. Second, if assets were secreted, kept in trunks, in family Bibles, or in accounts under other names, then the probate court could only adjudicate based on what it could legally establish. In the Borden suite of filings, estate inventories, indefinido pending extraction from surrogates' court records, show both listed items and marginal notations about possible unregistered assets. Those marginalia were the seedbed for later disputes. Theory: estates as a site of conflict. A useful historical insight is to see estates not simply as passive repositories of value, but as active sites where social relationships are clarified or broken. In families where outward respectability masks private precarity, the death of a household member forces an accounting that can expose fragilities. The scramble to collect, to inventory, and to claim often reveals the true structure of authority and the material basis of familial loyalty. In the Borden matter, probate filings illuminate more about kinship claims and community relationships than they do about the crime itself. Yet they are indispensable in mapping incentive structures that legal actors may later use to argue motive. The trial proper, witnesses, and the weight of proof. When a trial proceeded, calendar specifics and docket numbers, indefinido, certain testimonies became focal points. Medical testimony about cause of death, limited by the period's techniques, was both authoritative and contestable. A coroner might testify to blunt force trauma or to wounds consistent with a particular implement. The defense would counter that wound sequencing could not be established with the requisite certainty. Lay witnesses recounted movements, gestures, or a disputed entrance at a window. Each account carried the weight of human fallibility. Cross-examination opened fissures. Defense attorneys pressed on timing, on the ability of witnesses to perceive at night, on whether a given document could have been seen by the witness prior to their attendance in court. Prosecutors attempted to bind witnesses to their earlier statements and to show how a mosaic of facts converged on the proposed narrative of culpability. The result was a courtroom rhythm of assertion and rebuttal, of moral rhetoric and evidentiary quietness. Outcome: judicial closure or perpetual uncertainty, indefinido. What we may say with confidence is that the legal system offers closure only to the degree the evidence allows. In this case, whether the accused, as named in indictment papers, or in coroner's recommendations, names and dates, indefinido, was convicted, acquitted, or never formally charged, is a factual question to be ascertained from court dockets and contemporary newspaper accounts that can be verified at the archive. The public memory of such cases often simplifies the legal outcome into a narrative of guilt or innocence. The archival reality, more commonly, is messier: plea bargains, hung juries, procedural dismissals, or a focus on civil remedies rather than criminal penalty. Until the documentary record is exhaustively consulted, the question of final adjudication in the Borden affair must remain indefinido. The aftermath: lives reconfigured. Whatever the legal result, the human consequence is predictable in its unpredictability. Survivors, children, house staff, distant relatives, found themselves entangled in the legal web. Reputation, once publicly stained, rarely returned to its prior sheen. Some family members withdrew from public life. Others attempted reinvention, relocating or changing names. Local institutions, churches, clubs, businesses, adjusted their social circuits to accommodate or to ostracize those connected to the affair. The town, too, registered the event as a test of civic character. Economic consequences followed. If assets were frozen during litigation, those who depended on the household's patronage or employment found themselves abruptly bereft. If creditors moved in, small properties were sometimes sold to pay arrears. In other instances, long-standing debts were quietly negotiated. The social capital lost in the public spectacle could be more damaging than any material dispossession. Historians' reappraisal, from hoarding to strategy. Decades after the event, when newspapers had yellowed and the immediate fervor subsided, historians and legal scholars returned to the case with new questions and the benefit of hindsight. Two dominant interpretive lines emerged in secondary literature and scholarly discussion. One line emphasized hoarding and eccentricity, the household as a repository of objects and secrets, an inward-looking world where papers, valuables, and resentments accumulated until they became combustible. This interpretation draws on descriptions of locked rooms, unvisited chambers, and the discovery of troves of domestic papers. It reads the household's inwardness as a cultural trait of a particular social type. The second line framed secrecy as strategy. It argued that, for families in precarious social positions, secrecy about income sources, about property transfers, about familial intimacy, was a rational response to threats. In this reading, what looks like eccentric hoarding is reinterpreted as defensive bookkeeping, a method of preserving assets from creditors, in-laws, or municipal tax collectors. The documentary evidence that supports this view is legal and financial, deeds, off-ledger transfers, and the formation of trust-like arrangements under third-party names. Both interpretations illuminate aspects of the case, and both are limited. The hoarding thesis explains the texture of domestic life. The strategic thesis explains potential motive. Neither, absent incontrovertible evidence, fully answers the question of why violence erupted, if in fact it did as a singular act of criminal intent. The historian's task is to weigh each interpretation against primary sources, and to resist the temptation to prefer narrative neatness over evidentiary complexity. Unresolved questions that still matter. Even after years of public interest and intermittent scholarly attention, several questions remain open, each demanding archival attention. The precise calendar. Was the year attached to the case, commonly cited as 1928 in some retellings, correct? If not, which year do primary sources identify? Unconfirmed. Docket entries and newspaper dates to be checked. The identity and legal status of key figures. Which family members were legally designated as heirs, and which persons were named in any will or codicil? Indefinido pending surrogates court records. The content and provenance of the documents. Were ledger entries independently verified with bank records? Could any transfer be traced with a check stub, bank endorsement, or teller affidavit? Indefinido, until bank archives and clerk records consulted. The chain of custody for items used at trial. Who received the documents first, and how were they authenticated? Indefinido, in the absence of a clear property inventory and chain of custody affidavits. The impact of media narratives on witnesses and jurors. Is there documentary evidence, letters, diaries, judicial admonitions to jurors that indicates how exposure to press coverage altered testimony or deliberation? Indefinido, possible in court records and private correspondence collections. Each of these questions is traceable to an archival repository. County courthouses, local newspaper morgues, bank archives, the private papers of attorneys who represented the parties, and the notebooks of investigators. Recovering them would move the case from a narrative scaffold to a dense documentary edifice. Ethical reflections, appetite and responsibility. One cannot end a story of public tragedy without pausing on ethics. True crime as a genre thrives on curiosity. It also has the power to replay harms. The spectatorship surrounding cases like the Bordens produces winners and losers in the court of public opinion. Families are watched, legacies are simplified, and complexity is often sacrificed for digestible moral lessons. For historians and storytellers, the obligation is to report with fidelity to sources and to alert audiences where certainty ends and interpretation begins. There is also an ethical question about retroactive diagnosis of motives. The temptation to say, with the benefit of narrative closure, that secret-keeping or class anxiety caused violence must be resisted. Motive is rarely singular. It is a lattice of pressures, psychological, economic, social, that the archives can illuminate but cannot reduce to a single cause without overwhelming evidence. Labeling speculation as theory and marking documentary gaps as indefinito are not rhetorical affectations. They are methodological guardrails. The long tail, legacy and public memory. In the years that followed, the Borden's story became, for some, a cautionary parable. A family ruined by secrecy, a town undone by gossip, a legal system stretched by public hunger for quick answers. For others, it became an emblem of the fragility of historical truth when mediated through sensationalist press practices. As generations removed the event from immediacy, memory accreted myth. Oral histories collected decades later sometimes conflated individuals and events, and popular retellings condensed the messy documentary record into a neat arc. The work of recovery, then, is twofold: to disentangle myth from archive, and to understand why certain myths persist. Why does the public repeatedly seize upon narratives of hidden hoards and clandestine monies? Part of the answer lies in cultural preoccupations with wealth and respectability. Part lies in the human appetite for stories that resolve moral ambiguity with a single betrayal or a single villain. Historians, by preserving and publishing the archival scaffolding, offer a corrective. Not a simpler story, but a more careful, sometimes more tragic one. Closing coda. When historians come to houses like the Bordens, they find architecture whose rooms are layered with memory, papers, and the sediment of everyday life. The discovery that began this narrative, the door opened, the lantern's hesitant light, the tilted chair, becomes symbolic not only of an act of violence or its aftermath, but of a rupture in social trust. What the archive offers is a laborious way back into that trust: patient transcription, corroboration, and an insistence that claims be accompanied by proof. This story, as it stands, is an invitation. It invites archival return to county ledgers and probate filings, to coroner's inquests, to private correspondence stored in dusty attics. It invites readers to weigh theories against documents and to prefer nuance to sensation. And it invites a moral posture of attention to the human lives intersecting a public case. The servants who gave testimony, the relatives who contested claims, the jurors who deliberated in the shadow of newspapers, and the descendants whose privacy deserves protection, who inherited not only property, but a public narrative. If you want to explore the sources for this account, the description below contains links to the primary repositories to consult and to suggested secondary readings for context. If you have documents, family papers, or leads related to this case, especially the coroner's report, probate docket, or bank ledger items, please share them in the comments or by contacting the archival institutions listed. Historical truth advances when the public participates in archival recovery. Thank you for joining this careful, source-oriented look at the horrifying and mysterious case that became known, in popular retellings, as the Borden family murders. If you found this deep dive meaningful, consider supporting further investigative history by exploring the links in the description and by subscribing. There are more archival cases to follow, each with their own fragile papers and human stories.